All right, I believe this is our group for tonight. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you. This is our penultimate lesson of the series. Next week is the final week. I was given the clearance once again for coffee and donuts, so we'll have that again. We've had a lot of treats this season, yeah. Well, some of us have. That's your fault. Okay?
It's not my fault.
You can have coffee next week. That's fine.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's great to see everyone. So we kind of have a lot to get to tonight since we stopped short last week. And we kind of have to get through it because I can't keep continuing things the following week because next week is the final week. So I think we'll get through everything okay. I made some decisions concerning the book. By the time we get to the next lesson, I'll fill you in, kind of. Yeah, we're going to have to do that a bit. But yeah, I'll pray, we'll do a little review so we know where we're picking up, and then we'll get going. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for everyone who was able to make it back out. I just pray that you'd be with us during this time of study. Help us to understand the depth of what your word is showing us about who you are and what you did for us. So I pray you'd be with us during this time. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, so who wants to tell us what we talked about last week?
You arrest and the kangaroo court trial.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Disciples sleeping and stuff like that.
The highlights, yeah.
They're really tired.
Yeah, so last week we talked about the idea of a rigged court, kangaroo court, and we talked quite a bit about the Last Supper and all of the ways that we understand how the elements in the supper that we use for communion point back to the Passover, the Exodus. That's a whole big thing we discussed at quite at length. And then Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Judas betrays him. Roman soldiers come and take him, and we got through most of Jesus's trial, which the book did a good job of explaining was very really corrupt. They sort of picked Jewish leaders to come and be part of this thing who they knew weren't really concerned with following proper Jewish law, different procedural law. We went through all that. That's in the book. And we ended before Jesus was sent to Pilate. So he was before the high priest, Caiaphas. That's where he was they got him, in a sense, on a blasphemy regulation. He accurately claimed to be Son of Man, which we remember from Daniel is the divine title, the human one, the Son of Man who is exalted up to heaven, sits at the right hand of God. Jesus claims to be this person. The Jewish leaders do not believe this, so therefore, blasphemy. Okay. So we're going to start this by him being sent to Pontius Pilate. But before we get, you can turn to Luke 23. That's where we'll be starting. But I guess my first simple question is, who is Pontius Pilate, and why do the Jewish people care?
Isn't he the one in charge, the Roman, that was in charge of, overseeing the area?
Yeah, so Pilate is the Roman governor who is over the area of Judea. Now, does anyone know why they had to bring the court to him?
Well, we're all there for this route.
Yeah.
The government.
Yeah. So, the Jewish people could do all sorts of things. Rome allowed a lot of freedom with the different people groups certain levels of freedom with the people groups that they ruled over. And the Jewish people had the ability to make many different legal calls. What they could not do is give someone the death sentence. So, centuries before, when Israel was their own nation, they're carrying out their own laws as they see fit. But now that Rome is over them, but if Rome's in charge, you're not the one who decides who lives and dies. Rome is. So Jesus went through the whole Jewish courts, but in order to get the death penalty that the Jewish leaders wanted, they have to bring the case to Pilate. And that's where we end up picking up here in Luke 23. We'll start in verse 1. And the whole multitude of them rose, the Jewish leaders, and led him, Jesus, to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Pilate asked him, saying, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And he answered and said, "Thou sayest it." Then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, "I find no fault in this man." And they were the more fierce, saying, "He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place." When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. So, right off the bat, thoughts, questions, anything that stands out to you?
He didn't buy the case.
He didn't buy the case, yeah. Yes. Oh, you're from Galilee? Send him to Herod. He's sort of in charge of
He
Galilee.
didn't want to overstep.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the problem. Yeah, so my big thought with that was, like Kim, no one wanted to be the one to deal with this situation. So even Pilate, who is legally in charge, sort of shuffles this off of his plate. Pick up in verse 9. Then he questioned him with many words. Let's pick that up in verse 8, since we skipped that. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, exceedingly glad to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have I'm having trouble reading tonight. And he hoped to have seen some miracles done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but Jesus, answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod, with his men of war, set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. The same day Pilate and Herod were made friends together. Before they were at enmity between themselves. And Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and rulers of the people, said unto them, "Ye have brought this man unto me, as one that perverteth the people, and behold, I have examined him before you, and have found no fault in this man touching the things whereof ye accuse him. No, nor yet Herod, for I sent you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done unto him. I will therefore chastise him, and release him, for of necessity he must release one unto them at the feast." I'll open that up for thoughts. I don't have a lot that I want to hit there, because this will basically flow directly into the next lesson as the trial becomes the crucifixion. So, any thoughts or questions there that jump out at you?
It brought Pilate and Herod together.
Yeah, good friends now. That's interesting.
I had thought about the first point, this carryover.
Yeah.
You ever think about this, that Herod said, "You know what, this is my chance now.
Mm-hmm.
I've been trying to get to this guy since he was born." And the wise man,
But isn't it the same Herod?
is it the same guy?
It's not the same.
It's not the same guy.
Yeah, so Mary and Joseph returned from Egypt with him when they found out that Herod had died. That's when they came back. But it's obviously, it's a son.
The same family.
Same family line.
They're all
There was 4, but they're all right.
other on. So I just thought.
But it's
I mean, I was
funny.
wrong technically, but then I guess I was.
It's a funny little personality trait of this Herod, because you remember this is the same Herod who liked hearing John the Baptist preach, even though John was often preaching against him. That's what got him in jail. But he still had some interest in this and kind of liked the spectacle. And he's like, wow, I've been trying to see this wonder worker guy for a long time. Maybe I'll see something really cool. And Jesus just says nothing to him. So as we move forward into the crucifixion, I will talk about Pilate releasing someone at the feast, at the Passover, that will become important. And we'll actually talk a little bit more about Pilate as a person. We'll read one thing out of the book before we just kind of get rid of it for the night. Two things, I guess. Turn to page 110. All right, there's a paragraph that starts with, the Jews who responded to Pilate's last defense of Jesus reminded the governor that Jesus had said he is the Son of God. Remembering his wife's dream, I'll hit on that, Pilate became frightened. He asked Jesus where he was from. Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate was frustrated, but Jesus remained calm and in control throughout the entire proceedings. It was ironic that Pilate should declare, I have power to release thee. He had been trying, yet failed at every turn. So that there's a lot that we're skipping. There are details throughout all the three Gospels that, as usual, they just kind of hit on different things. We are told in one of the Gospels that Pilate's wife had a dream concerning Jesus. We're not told the details of it, but she wanted Pilate to have nothing to do with this guy. She thought this was going to be terrible for them if anything happens to him. And Pilate, already having some ideas, seemed to take her seriously. And then towards the bottom, probably the last paragraph on page 110, the Jewish leaders, not to be denied the victory within their grasps, found another weak spot to exploit Pilate's character. They reminded him that if he released Jesus, Caesar would hear of it, and that would emphasize Jesus' claim to be a king. Caesar wanted no rivals, and Pilate would suffer if he helped one. Pilate surrendered his legal convictions to the threat of his position. He had Jesus flogged and then handed him over for crucifixion. So there's a lot going on with that, but just basically, Pilate sort of just worried about himself in the end. As someone who is the governor of Judea, someone who they claims to be the king of Judea, it's hard to let that guy go and feel that you are still in control and that Caesar in Rome will be perfectly fine with you releasing some rebel Jewish king. And that's what finally gives him in, that's what finally makes Pilate just say, okay, do what you're going to do. And that brings us to the crucifixion. Does anyone have a question about anything I just said? That's fine, you don't have to. I know that was it's a little scattered. We were taking stuff from different parts of the three Gospels and kind of just mashing them together. What the book does for the crucifixion lesson is basically just focus on his time literally going to the cross, and then basically on 8 statements made by Jesus throughout the 4 Gospels as he's on the cross. They didn't actually cover a whole lot of the crucifixion itself. To me, it seemed best for us to actually just pick an account and just do a straight Bible study through it. So that's what I think we're going to do. Well, that's what we're going to do tonight. After tonight, if you're interested, the lesson is good. It would take 10, 15 minutes tops to read through it on your own if you wanted to. But I think dealing with the crucifixion without actually dealing with the crucifixion seems like a silly way to go about it. So you won't need your book for the rest of the night. I want to get you guys doing a lot more talking. We can turn to Mark chapter 15. We're going to use Mark's description because, as everything else in the Gospel of Mark, it's pretty bare bones. Everyone else has different details. Mark just kind of gives a very straight description, and he hits all the points that I think we need to hit for the message to have its impact. And we're basically going to go through the chapter, and I have it broken up into 6 segments. And I'll forewarn you, at the end of each segment, I'm going to ask my normal thoughts, questions, concerns. I have things that I think we need to hit in each section, but then I'm open for whatever you guys find compelling. So, Mark 15, we're going to start in verse 5. This will kind of back us up into the trial. Jesus yet answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Now at the feast, the Passover feast, he released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them that had made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection. And the multitude, crying aloud, began to desire him to do as he had ever done unto them. But Pilate answered them, saying, do you want me to release unto you the king of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy. But the chief priests moved the people, that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. Pilate answered and said again unto them, What will ye then that I should do unto him whom ye call the king of the Jews? And they cried out again, Crucify him. Then Pilate said unto them, Why? What evil hath he done? And they cried out more exceedingly, Crucify him. So Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them, and delivered Jesus, when he had scourged him, to be crucified. Okay, thoughts, questions, things you find interesting?
As this is all Jesus' plan, it sounds like he was purposely pushing his plan by not answering these questions. Because if he really wanted to not get out of it, but it could have changed. It could have been a completely different situation if he had answered those questions. But he was kind of like being closed-lipped about it. And that went against him technically.
But he also knew that they were enemies on Pilate.
Yeah.
You could see right through everything.
Pilate, being the Roman official, he is steeped in the art of deception. He clearly sees motives not in the line of justice.
So with the feast, when they release the prisoners, it's just like a way to appease them, like, hey, we blocked somebody that we might care about, and we're going to let you go, let somebody go. And why was only, I guess, I don't know if there's ever an account of why there was only Jesus or random murder, like there's nobody else locked up.
Well, that's the interesting thing, because we'll find out that Jesus is crucified next to 2 other people. So there are clearly other people on the chopping block. I don't know if that is something that the Jewish leaders would propose. Like maybe they wanted Barabbas and Pilate steps in and says, well, what about this Jesus guy? It's a way to appease the people, and we'll talk about it a little bit. There are very delicate power balance that plays out in the area. Anything else?
Seems that the chief priests are just living up on him. Just studying
who knows how they would have went before leadership got involved. Okay, so Barabbas. It is an incredibly simple name that basically means something like son of the Father. So you're familiar with like Abba, that comes up in the New Testament as the word for father. Bar, like when Jesus calls him Simon Bar Jonah, that is Simon, son of Jonah. It's just a Jewish prefix for a word. So literally means something like son of the Father. It's interesting that he is in prison, about to be crucified for causing an insurrection, so trying to tear down the local government in some way. He killed someone doing it. And this is the man that's paired next to Jesus. Now, we've been talking throughout this series that the people wanted their warrior messianic king. They wanted Rome to be pushed out of Judea forever. They want violent revolution. And the person standing there next to Jesus is the violent revolutionary. And they're kind of confronted with a choice here. You know, like you're kind of taken back to, are you going to do it God's way, or are you going to take matters into your own hands? It's people choosing to do what was right in their own eyes, kind of like our judges. It's taking good and evil into your own hands. It's their final decision that the Jewish people seem to have, as we've seen them on a collision course with Rome that Jesus has prophesied countless times. If you don't turn back, if you don't repent of what you're doing, the judgment is coming. And you sort of have this final moment where you get to choose the true Messiah or the Messiah you wanted. And they choose to have Barabbas released to them. They choose their path. This also looks a lot like the Day of Atonement. We talked about that last week a little bit. The Day of Atonement, which is a Jewish feast that takes place in the fall. And it is for the covering of the sins of the people. You have 2 lambs or goats. And what they do is they basically, I think they cast lots usually, right? Yeah, they cast lots. And one is determined for the sacrifice. So basically you would take one lamb, one spotless lamb that was like just a pure, innocent animal. That was going to be killed, the blood sprinkled on the altar. The other lamb would have the sins of the people symbolically placed on it. So the high priest would take this other one, put his hand on it, like repent of the sins of the people over it, and it was a symbolic transfer of the sins of all of Israel placed on this one. So that would be sent off into the desert to die. Like you send the sin without the camp, like away from the camp into the wilderness. That's where sin should be. Sin should not be with the people. That's the symbolic idea. And then the innocent one, the one that doesn't have the sins placed on it, is sacrificed on the altar. So you have this same idea playing out that like the insurrection, the rebellion, the godlessness is the sins of Israel at this time. This is why they're about to be judged by Rome, among other things. And in this scenario, you have Jesus, the innocent one, sacrificed, while Barabbas, who is like a representation of the will and the sin of the people, he gets released back among them. So there's a lot playing out here. I will say, sort of to Greg's point about Pilate, he decides to release, it seems to be local custom that the Roman governor releases a prisoner at one of their most important feast days, in this case, the Passover. There was a really delicate power balance between the Roman officials and the people who they governed. So Pilate's in an odd situation, because he has to keep Caesar happy. Caesar is his boss. But he also has to keep the Jewish people somewhat placated, because if there is riot and rebellion and uproar in your area that you're governing, you won't be governing it very long. So Pilate is actually historically quite a brutal leader. He's a pretty brutal figure. There's actually a scenario that you get a glimpse of throughout one of the Gospels where one of the capitulations they made with the Jewish people was they wouldn't print Caesar's face on the money. because there was like an image of Caesar and the Jewish people wouldn't they wouldn't spend that money. So they had like special Jewish Roman coins made. And then one day Pilate decides, you know what, we're gonna put my face on this. You know, like he just did not care. And there was like a rebellious coup, and he had a bunch of Jewish people killed, and there's a whole lot going on. And I feel like what we see in the Gospels is Pilate doing his absolute best to not lose control of the Jewish population. I don't remember the exact time frame, but I want to say less than a decade after the crucifixion, something else goes very wrong in Judea, and Pilate is recalled to Rome. Like he's too brutal, he's too overbearing, and it kind of seems like as he's capitulating to the Jewish people here, he's trying to avoid what he just had happen a few years before. Like he's trying to avoid riot at all cost, and this sort of takes us to where we are. But last thing, verse 15, Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them, and delivered Jesus when he had scourged him to be crucified. Can someone quickly tell us what scourging is?
Isn't that a word for things at the end that will tear the skin off?
Yeah, cat o' nine tails. Yeah, so that was a brutal whip, not like a bull whip. It was more, typically had 9 tails on it, hence the name, which they would put stone or glass or metal, whatever got the job done best. It was such a brutal, what? Hooks, yeah.
The pirates used the hooks.
What?
The pirates later used the hooks.
Of course. So, yeah, it was such a brutal torture technique that, like, there are accounts of some Roman prisoners who would be disemboweled by the cat of nine tails before they ever made it to be crucified. Like, it was an ugly thing. And the Bible just has this in a phrase and just kind of moves on. I'm sorry to be so graphic with it, but I'm like, we're talking about the crucifixion. It won't be fun until next week. Like, next week is going to be great. There's no down next week. But we're adults. It's not a children's Bible study. We'll get into the details with it. I'm not trying to. That'll probably be most of the details, actually. That was it. So if you handle that, we're good. Let's move on to verse 16. And the soldiers led him away into the hall called Praetorium, and they called together the whole band. And they clothed him with purple, and plaited a crown of thorns, and put it about his head, and began to salute him, Hail, King of the Jews! And they smote him on the head with a reed, and did spit upon him, and bowing their knees, worshipped him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple from him, and put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. Thoughts on that? I only have one thought, but anything that jumps out at you.
Very mocking, Alice.
What's that?
Very mocking.
Yes, it was.
Purple is a matter of legal color.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those situations where, kind of like we were talking about, I bring it up a lot with John the Baptist. If you would see it, he is the Elijah who was supposed to come. They're sort of doing the, like, if you could only see it, like if you could see what you're actually doing, in absolute mockery, they're doing the thing that he actually is. Like, he actually is the king. He is the Messiah. And they have this photo-negative, upside-down version of it, where it's just, from their point of mind, they're completely mocking him by giving him a robe and a crown. But, man, if they could just see it, like, he's actually the king, and that's the tragic irony of what's happening here. Let's go on with verse 21. And they compelled one, Simon, a Cyrenian, who passed by, coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. And they bring him into the place Golgotha, which is, being interpreted, the place of a skull. And they gave him to drink wine mingled with myrrh, but he received it not. When they had crucified him, they parted his garments, casting lots upon them, what every man should take. And it was the third hour, and they crucified him. The superscription, or the accusation, was written over the King of the Jews. And with him they crucified two thieves, the one on his right hand, the other on his left. And the scripture was fulfilled, which saith, "And he was numbered with the transgressors." And they that passed by railed on him, wagging their heads, and saying, "Ah, thou that destroyest the temple and buildest it in 3 days, save thyself, come down from the cross." Likewise also the chief priests mocking, said among themselves with the scribes, "He saved others, himself he cannot save. Let Christ, the King of Israel, descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe." And they that were crucified with him reviled him. All right, thoughts, concerns, interests?
Was there more than one or three? It always sounds like there's three people on crosses, but it sounds like there was more than just the three of them. Or was it?
Oh, I always thought it was just the three of them.
Well, it just said that he's numbered among the transgressors, so it sounds like more of a group.
Oh, I got you. Yeah.
I just feel like that's just in number of ones before him as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Right.
As opposed to them all being there.
Mm-hmm.
They're just looking at the two there. Look at all the ones that before he was numbered
Mm-hmm.
among them all. That's just
Right.
how I look at it.
Well, and even the fact that he is crucified numbers him, like, makes him out to be a transgressor, because crucifixion was only for low-life criminals. That was, I don't believe actual Roman citizens could be crucified, if I'm correct. Yeah, so you had to be under Roman control, but not a Roman citizen.
Yeah, the Romans were kind to Romans, you got your head chopped off.
I'm all for that. If I was executed, that's the way to
That was
go.
considered, you weren't suffering, it wasn't one.
Yeah,
It was less humiliation, but there was dignity to having your head.
yeah.
No, no joke.
No,
That's
no.
what they call it.
Yeah, the Apostle Paul, that's
Yeah,
theoretically how he went,
yes.
according to church history.
You know what's interesting? The Jews seem like they gamble a lot. Like, every time we turn around, look, let's cast some lots. Let's see who wants to win this one.
I think it's the Roman soldiers casting lots for his clothes, right?
Was it? And how about the other time they cast lots?
Oh, I'm not saying they don't, but
No, I mean, it just seems like every time we turn around, they're all, you know.
yeah.
That's how they thought they figured to determine God's will.
Mhm.
They roll like a roll that does.
Right.
Holy
Yeah.
roll.
They get throwing straws every time we turn around. But it's just interesting that they just keep going with that instead of
Yeah.
just using their brain for something.
Well, I don't think it's a bad solution if you're splitting up clothes. Be like picking straws, you know? It's kind of more fair. But yeah, no, dice as a form of like divination was a big deal back in the day. Was I talking with you about this? I found out very recently that Julius Caesar, before he crossed the Rubicon, you know, bringing his army into mainland Rome to begin the Civil War, he did it on the cast of a die. Like, there's literally a Latin phrase that translates to "the die is cast," which I'm sure you've heard. He decided that the gods want him to do this. He cast the die, he got whatever, I don't know if he was doing an over-under or what the deal was. But, yeah, that's crazy. But yeah, so casting lots was a big deal in the ancient world.
You know.
Yeah, sorry for the rabbit trail, but you were correct. You were correct.
Gambling money.
Yeah.
All the time.
So I think it's interesting, especially from a historical perspective. So we have, verse 21 talks about the man Simon of Cyrene, Simon Cyrenian, who ends up carrying the cross of Jesus up to Golgotha. It says he's the father of Alexander and Rufus. And I go, okay, Mark must have mentioned them before, right? No, they're not in the rest of the book. So that makes you wonder, like, who does he expect to know who this is?
Right.
And you gotta think that, so whatever Christian community he was writing this directly to at the time, they had to know them, right? That it's not certain, but I go like, he expected someone to understand that, you know?
Wrong place, wrong time. And then he found out who it was later.
Yeah, who knows? There is an Alexander and a Rufus who show up in Acts, not together, but they show up in Acts, they show up in a couple of Paul's letters. Now, they're not uncommon names, at least Alexander isn't. But we don't actually know who they are. So that's interesting. They offer Jesus wine and myrrh. Do we know what that's about?
Yeah, it also says,
Yeah.
it's like a morphine or something like that, you know, with the whole everything.
Yeah.
Who offered that?
What's that?
Who offered that?
The Romans.
He turned it down.
Yeah, verse 23. They're speaking of the guards.
Why would they do that? I don't know why. No, why would they want to do that?
I don't think they felt the same way as the Jews did.
I think that's likely.
They want to suffer, to make a painkiller.
Well, yeah, so when Pastor says something like morphine, it's like, you know, it's still wine mingled with like a tree resin, basically. It wasn't, it wouldn't put him out. Like it's like a slight kindness. It's not like he wouldn't feel anything after that.
Right.
So yeah, it could be that maybe the Romans were like, maybe they didn't have enough malice for him because they know, some of them think he's a good guy.
It does seem that they had compassion for him occasionally.
Sounds like
It wasn't the first time
Yeah.
that they had compassion for someone like that. Right, the one who got saved, we talked about that several weeks back.
Yeah.
Because he was just, passionate for it.
Yeah.
I don't know, it doesn't seem like they were all like super rotten. They just worked for him.
Yeah.
Work for the super rotten people.
Yeah.
Most of the emperors were pretty tough.
They had their moments, yeah. Yeah, so we get the sign placed above Jesus on the cross. I guess they would typically let you know as a passerby why this person is being crucified. And the accusation is King of the Jews. Now Mark leaves out some details that others add where when people see this, they go to Pilate and say, you should write, he claimed he was the King of the Jews. And Pilate says, okay, I wrote what I wrote. And it's written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, and it's a statement about Jesus as king to basically any literate human being on the planet who could read that. So they mock some of the Jewish people mock him for claiming, like, hey, you were the one who said you could destroy the temple and raise it up in 3 days, look at you now. And of course the Gospels had told us that that was a metaphor, the temple was his body. He's literally doing that at that moment that they're mocking him. He's saying, my body will be destroyed in 3 days, it will be rebuilt, I'll rise again. He's literally in the act of doing that as they mock him for it. And then we get the physician's heal thyself or save thyself. He saved others, he could not save himself. And this is also something Jesus had talked about. I wrote down Luke 4:23. That's where he says, they'll, in days to come, they'll take up the proverb, physician, heal thyself. And this all just kind of, he knew how this was going to play out. And it's playing out exactly how he thought it would. Let's move on. I think we're on track to get this done. So that's good. Mark 15, verse 33. When the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land. I'll clarify right from the start. The way Jewish people work with time, your days sort of, they're measuring hours from 6 a.m. So he's crucified, verse 33 is starting at noon. When the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, 3 o'clock. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is being interpreted, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And some of them that stood by when they heard it said, Behold, he calleth Elias. And one ran to fill up a sponge full of vinegar and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, leave him alone. Let us see whether Elias will come to take him down. Jesus cried with a loud voice and gave up the ghost. And the veil of the temple was rent in twain from top to bottom. And when the centurion stood over against him, saw that he so cried out and gave up the ghost, he said, Truly, this man was the Son of God. There were also women looking on afar off, whom was Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James the Less, and Joseph, and Salome. Yep, okay. All right, initial thoughts. A lot happened there, sort of.
Why did we give a vinegar?
I am not entirely sure. Maybe
It doesn't seem like a mean gesture, like where he says leave him alone, like, you know what I mean? But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that has a different meaning than it would for us today. Do you know that, Pastor? Because she asked about the vinegar. What does that do, per se?
The vinegar?
Yeah, they're going to give him vinegar. So he already had to offer the wine and myrrh earlier.
Yeah. So when it got the vinegar, I always thought it was another word for some type of medicated. It's wine. It's still a degree of wine.
Mm.
But I don't know if there's a difference in strength.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
The wine turns vinegar.
Yeah. So, your guess is mine.
Yeah, so maybe something even
A little
stronger.
stronger, yeah.
As he's kind of in his
Yeah,
last
you get closer
throes of
to
agony.
actually dying.
Yeah, that would make sense. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions with this?
Yeah, you want to give us your thoughts on verse 34?
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Well,
Especially the end part. Like if somebody's just reading this,
Yeah.
it sounds kind of
yeah.
bizarre.
Let's hold that for like a minute. I want to get to that in depth. Any other thoughts or questions that jumped out at you?
What did he mean by when 137, when he says, then he gave up the ghost?
Oh, so that would be it's a euphemism for death. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's even though he's being executed, this is important.
The voluntary nature.
Laying down his life. So even though he's being executed, he decided when he gave up the spirit, because human life was over.
Yeah.
So they didn't take it, because the Bible can explain it, they didn't take it even though they executed it. He laid it down. So it's not just the fact that he willingly went to the cross, it's that he decided when he would expire. And
Yeah, because is it Luke that
Yeah,
says gave up the
Luke's got
spirit?
a lot of details.
Yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, my answer was a little too short. Pastor's right. Yeah, so while it is a euphemism for death, it's the idea that, yes, he sort of ended it in a sense. If that...
Yeah, because
Pastor's going to...
because there was a point where, of what's going on that's not said directly here, you learn it better in the epistles, or the rest of it, that he's making payment for sin. He's making atonement for sin before God the Father. So once that atonement was made for the sins of the world, he made payment for the sins of the world. There was no other reason for him not to then expire and be done with that part of his sacrifice, what that was about. So he willingly did all that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Mark, being typically sparse and focused on the suffering of Christ, at the end there when he gives up the ghost, he just sort of lets out a cry and expires. A lot of the other Gospels are heavily concerned with things that were said on the cross near the time of his death. And we should, even without the epistles, we should get from all the Jewish messaging about the sacrifice language around what he's doing, that he is making the atonement. And then the Gospel of John goes out of its way to point out Jesus crying, "It is finished," right before he gives up the ghost. So yeah, it's very much like the payment has been made at this point, and then he allows that to end. Yeah, no, good question.
What do you think, because nobody said anything.
Yeah.
What do you think about, how many people do you think were there, roughly? Hundreds, thousands?
I would say not as many as we typically have in our heads.
Okay, so 9. All right, so we'll go with 9.
Yeah.
Now, but what do you think they thought? Like, what was in their heads when it didn't get cloudy? It was dark for 3 straight hours in the middle of the day.
Yeah.
Like it was nighttime.
Yep.
So there had to be a lot of crazy thoughts.
Yeah.
But it's just like I say.
Yeah.
Well, and there was enough signal that the Centurion, who, to me, like reading that story, I'm like, I get that he was the king of the Jews, but he got it too.
Yeah.
Without, so obviously there's more of the story.
Yeah. Yeah, so that brings me well to what my first thought was. Yeah, darkness during the day. Yes, yeah, I believe definitely Matthew, maybe Luke as well, but definitely Matthew. Yeah, okay, so why don't we take these things in order, because now we basically hit all the stuff that I wanted to talk about, because these are really important points, and this is why I wanted to go through the account and not just some of the words of Christ. Okay, we'll start with darkness. Darkness over the land is day of the Lord language. So throughout the prophets, there are these poetic descriptions where Jerusalem is being judged for their sin. Babylon is coming. And he says, the sun and moon won't give their light. And he gives this big idea of the apocalyptic nature of what's happening as God's judgment rains down on Jerusalem. So, I don't know if I didn't write down any verses. But you can find that especially, I want to say Isaiah, Ezekiel, for sure. You probably get some of that in Zephaniah. That's on my mind lately. So you have this event occur as Jesus is taking the judgment of God as the sacrifice for the people. So you have the decreation, like the sun doesn't even shine on this. This is God's wrath poured out on the sacrifice, on his son. So yeah, you get the darkness, and that's very important. And it's, I think 3 hours has good symbolic poetry. I mean, I believe it happened for 3 hours, but when we're thinking biblical numbers, yeah, if it's going to happen any number of hours, it should happen 3 hours. Right? That's how that works. Okay, so we have we'll jump from that to verse 34. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. One, I think there's an interesting historical thing happening there again, like we talked about with who did Mark expect to know Alexander. This is an interesting little thing where he cries out in Aramaic the start of a psalm, Psalm 22. And it's interesting that the Roman standing by, who hears this, knows enough about the Jewish faith that he has heard of Elijah, or Elias in the Greek. And he knows that's an important Jewish figure, but he clearly doesn't know the Aramaic dialect that the Jewish people speak to know that that is not what he said. Like, this is a very unique misinterpretation or misunderstanding between two ethnic groups. Just historically, I think that's interesting. Like, he didn't speak the language Jesus spoke, but he knew enough to get him in trouble. Like, he wasn't calling for Elijah, but interesting miscommunication. Now, what he is actually saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I have seen Christians take this and turn it into basically an entire doctrine, and I think that's dangerous, because I don't think that's what's happening here. Some people will take this and say, what he's expressing is, God is actually literally forsaking him in this moment. God is turning away because God can't look at sin. And then I'm like, well, I've read the book of Job, and God talks to the devil. I think, he looks on you and me. He can deal with our sin. What I see Jesus doing, he's throwing out the first line of Psalm 22. It's a psalm of David that continues in this vein. He's in whatever terrible situation David is in. The walls are closing in. It looks dark, it looks bleak, things are not going well. And David goes on to express, in spite of all this, he has hope in the Lord. And it sort of turns in, whenever you're dealing with David, you're dealing with a Messiah-like figure. But the psalm itself turns into this pretty clearly messianic message. And even though it looks like death and destruction and God is maybe not with him at this time, it ends on this note of incredible hope that he will be raised up, that he will he'll be raised up, there will be rejoicing, he will be counted as great after this. And this is, Jesus quotes at least the beginning. That's all we have recorded in the Gospels. We have the first verse. But it's the first verse of something that should trigger an entire storyline in our heads from that psalm, if we know the Psalms as well as the Jewish people did. I don't think this is a deep doctrinal statement that somehow God, that they're disconnected in any way, that he is ashamed of what's happened. Like this is God's plan. This is the plan from eternity past. And Jesus quotes a heartbreaking and beautiful psalm that very accurately reflects what he's going through as the suffering servant. That's how I see that.
Even if you didn't know that it was a psalm, could it be looked at as, I know it wasn't the final words, but could it be looked at as some of the final words that show that when the Son of God came to this earth, he was human? Oh, sure. So maybe you could look at it a little bit like that?
Yeah, no matter what, he's still expressing deep grief and agony. Like, it just helps to know that there's hope at the end, even though we don't see it here. When we know its context, we know it ends in victory for the psalmist, not the defeat that it looks like. It's all good.
It's the picture.
Yeah.
Because David was like that. Some of the other ones, it's the picture of all this tragedy that's It looks like God's forsaken me.
Yep.
When you look at the picture, just a picture, you know. so-
Yep.
Yeah, so, yeah, because God is not going to divest of himself.
Yeah.
And that's,
Yeah.
even though we got three persons of God, you know, we got to be careful.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The veil in the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. Anyone want to take a shot at that?
It's really tall.
It was very tall.
So it's
That is
from
apt.
the top to the bottom.
Yeah.
It wasn't done by man. In
Okay.
theory.
Yep. Yep.
I mean, I think it was real.
Oh yeah, no, I don't doubt that. We don't have any Jewish reports of curtain mending, but from the Gospels, I have no reason to disbelieve it. What do we think it means?
We had access to God through Christ.
Yeah, so we've described the temple many times. And what was behind the veil was the Ark of the... Well, no. The Ark of the Covenant was not behind this veil. Because this was... The Ark of the Covenant was laying in wait for Indiana Jones. But they still had what was considered the Holy of Holies. Even without the Ark, that was where the presence of God was supposed to dwell. And as the final sacrifice is made, freeing people from sin, death, atoning for sin, the veil, the thing that separated humanity from God, is torn in two from top to bottom. It's the best image you could possibly give for there is now meant to be no more separation between God and man. That man is supposed to be able to, we don't need a Jewish priesthood now. We've had the last sacrifice. We should have direct access to God the Father. And that's what's happening in the temple. And that's really important. That's a huge deal for us.
So now we have direct contact. We don't need any intervention. Tell this guy so he can pray.
Yeah. Yeah, so when letters in the New Testament make a big deal that you Christians are a holy priesthood, it's the idea that now you don't have to go through the sons of Aaron, you don't have to go through the priest to access God. The veil is torn, there's no more separation. So yeah, that's an important idea. Okay? And then I had a note about the Centurion, but we brought that up. And after the darkness would be alarming. But however Jesus conducted himself in his final moments on the cross made this guy say, wow. I don't know exactly what that was, but something about him just made him say, wow, this is the Son of God. And that's a huge deal. That's kind of like our first post-cross convert, if you will. I don't know where he actually went with his faith from there, but he knew something happened. Let's try to finish this up. I don't want to run into next week with stuff hanging on. Okay, verse 42. And now, when the evening was come, because it was the preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, an honorable counselor, which also waited for the kingdom of God, came and went in boldly unto Pilate, and craved the body of Jesus. Pilate marveled if he were already dead. And calling unto him the centurion, he asked him whether he had been any while dead. And when he knew it of the centurion, he gave the body to Joseph. And he bought fine linen, and took him down, and wrapped him in the linen, and laid him in a sepulchre, which was hewn out of stone, and rolled a stone unto the door of the sepulchre. And Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, beheld where he was laid. So this kind of hits on what Pastor was saying earlier, that once the sacrifice was made, Jesus gave up the ghost. He laid down his life. It was not taken from him. Because Pilate was shocked that he was already dead. Because crucifixions, as brutal as they are meant to be long and slow processes. So some of the other Gospels tell us that basically because the Sabbath was coming up, the Jewish people don't have people hanging on crosses on the Sabbath. So the Roman guards are coming with hammers, basically, I believe, they're going to break the knees of the people on the cross, which means they can't hold themselves up, and eventually you'll suffocate pretty quickly when you're being hung like that. But they get to Jesus, he's already dead. Might be John or Luke that mentions the spear, where they're basically like, is he dead? We should check. And they stab him in the side with the spear, and you have blood and water, and that has other theological significance. But he chose when, how he would die, how he would be sacrificed for the world. And we have the situation where Joseph of Arimathea, he seems to be a businessman that's in other places. He's like a pre-cross Christian, he's a follower of Jesus. He comes, asks for the body, and buries him in presumably his own tomb, something that was already carved out, and they place him in a tomb and roll a stone in front of it. So I think that's basically where we should leave it. I'll do a little wrap up, but any final thoughts? Something I can answer, or something you just want to add?
I think a lot of us were under the impression that the stone was incredibly gigantic and this and that because of when he did rise.
Yeah.
Like, there was accusation that somebody must have stolen the body. There was the impression that the rock was.
Yeah.
So that makes Joseph like incredibly strong. He put the stone over. I'm just saying.
No, so yeah, there's a little bit of historic know-how to understand that. So, no, the stone would have looked like what you always see in pictures of like a very large, typically flat, round stone. They were so heavy that basically what you would do is you would have something carved big enough to fully cover the hole, and then they would dig into the ground in front of the tomb. And they typically needed like a lever system to get the big stone to roll over into place, like slightly underground, so it was completely sealed off. So while...
So it was good to start, it's just afterwards it was done.
Yeah, exactly. It was quite a process to open those back up. Yeah.
You see the movie Patrick Christ?
I've never seen it.
Really?
Yes.
It's good. And it's pretty, the movie.
Pretty accurate.
Pretty accurate.
Yeah, I've heard that.
He was whipped and.
Yeah.
all that. It was pretty
And the
bloody.
stone and everything.
Yeah.
It's pretty accurate.
Yeah.
Pretty brutal to watch.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
But it was pretty, seemed like a good point of what we're reading.
Yeah. No, I know they take they do some symbolic, kind of like artistic scenes, and that's good. It's a movie, like you're allowed to do that. I've heard stories of people like literally coming out of that as a Christian. Like they never understood it until they saw it in front of them. Like especially like maybe they've been in church for a while, they kind of knew it, but they didn't really know it. And then they see it played out so well, and they go like, oh.
Well, it's like anything else.
Yeah.
You can read a book and not when you just read it, you watch a movie, okay, I get it.
Right.
Watching something is a lot easier than reading something and understanding, so
Yeah.
that could be it too.
Yeah.
It seemed it was accurate, or whatever.
Yeah.
Patrick, you see it?
No. What's it called again?
Passion of Christ.
Oh, okay.
It'll be through the holidays, I'm sure.
I've never seen the entire thing.
Christmas.
No gift,
And that's my line, I always see like this.
yeah, no gift is good.
Yeah, directly.
I think I would try out movies.
Yeah.
The only bad thing that I ever heard about it was that it was heavy on the actual violence, but it was light on the spirituality.
Probably, yeah.
So
Wow,
that's just what I heard.
yeah. Doesn't look accurate. Anyways.
Yeah. No, that's good.
I don't want to keep it, but the thing that is because you're staying with the text.
Yeah.
So it's really important that Christ died for the sins of the world.
Yeah.
Which he did. He was the Savior of the world. But when he cried it was finished, he made the payment. That doesn't mean everybody in the world is automatically what we call saved.
Yeah.
And they're not automatically a Christian.
Yeah.
Because you can finish what? With
Yes.
this. Because it's important when we look at this type of thing, we can draw the conclusion, well, he did it, and
Yeah.
we're good.
Yeah.
You know, we're good now, but it's gotta be appropriate. And
No, for sure.
That's the faith.
Yeah, no, and that's why, like, for all the teaching of Jesus that we've been doing over this time, the cross is the central theme of the gospel. So, like, just in the lesson tonight, we saw how humanity chooses what it wants, as it rejects God's way, lets Jesus be crucified, and we choose Barabbas. We choose the thing that we think is right, that we think is good, and we tend to reject what God actually has for us. And we see Jesus willingly going to die on the cross, giving up his life as the Passover, the sacrifice that saved them from Egypt, from the power of sin and death. We see him acting as the atonement lamb that is a covering for sin, a blotting out of the sin of the people. From the messianic perspective, from Psalms and prophets, we see him, the point of the Messiah was to bring the nations to God, to the God of Israel, that had been kind of scattered, doing their own things, worshiping their own gods, that all people were meant to stream back, partake in that promise of Abraham. The veil gets torn. There is now no more barrier between man and God. And yet the call still goes out of follow me. Like Pastor said, just because he paid for the sin of the world does not mean that you have partaken of the sacrifice. Like we talked about with communion last week. The idea that you have to come to Christ to partake of that sacrifice, to accept the sacrifice, accept the gift that he has offered in himself on the cross. So, especially the Apostle Paul tends to flesh this out. Romans does it extremely well with the idea of the sacrifice is made, but you have to believe, you have to put your hope in Christ, you have to be willing to confess that he actually is who he said he is. He actually did what he said he would do. Otherwise, you're choosing Barabbas instead of actually choosing and following the sacrifice that was made. So we believe that comes by faith. That as we have faith in Christ, we are faithful to the calling of Christ. That this is what, when we as Baptists talk about being saved, that's what that is, that we accept by faith the sacrifice that was made as Jesus demonstrates his power over death, his forgiveness of sins as that atoning sacrifice. So that's why we push some of that so hard sometimes, because it's not just, okay, Jesus did that cool thing way back when, now we're good. It's, well, no, I have to accept that. I have to follow him. I have to have faith in what he did believe that, live that, follow that. Like that's how the progression is supposed to go. If I have faith in what Jesus did, I'll follow him. So for us, we see that as the biblical way to have your sins forgiven, to, yes, we can talk about heaven. That doesn't cross my mind half the time because there's so much for me about following Christ here and now that maybe it's because I'm 30, I don't think about it that much. But yeah, that's the gospel. Whenever we talk about the gospel, it's placing your faith in the finished work of Christ on the cross for salvation from sins, for eternity with him in heaven. So this is what it's been angling at the whole. I'm not trying to preach here, but this is what the lesson's been building to the whole time. This is what the entire earthly ministry of Jesus has been pointing to, and this is why we studied David, because 1,000 years before, the life of David was pointing to what would finally happen. The Jewish feasts and sacrifices were pointing towards what would be done on the cross. The entire history of eternity is pointing towards the cross, because that's our only solution to the problem. That's all we have, and that's what was offered. And yeah, that's what we believe is the good news, the gospel, that the sacrifice has been made, sin has been defeated. We have to have faith in him and walk in that. So I think that's what I have for tonight. Not trying to leave it super heavy. I don't know if there's a way to leave it light when you go through the crucifixion. But yeah, that's what we've been working towards. That's the gospel. That's why we have church. That's why we do anything we do with the teachings of Jesus, the life of Jesus, because he was the sacrifice. He paid the price, and then we follow him. So I'll leave it there. Next week we'll get to the happier part of the gospel, which is the resurrection, which is much lighter and just as important as the cross. So let's leave it there. We'll close in prayer. Lord, thank you for this day. I thank you for what you did on the cross, and I hope that we understand it a little bit better than we did before, even if we've known all of this to an extent. I just pray that the depth of what your word has for us would let us see you more clearly, see what you did more clearly, and that we would follow you wholeheartedly. I just thank you for what you did, and I thank you for this study of it. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen.